History is not just a collection of dates and facts, it's a tapestry woven with threads of triumph and tragedy, moments that reshaped the world in ways we're still grappling with today. But behind the grand narratives of progress lie darker chapters, events so unsettling they've left permanent scars on humanity's collective memory. Some of these moments are whispered about in history books, while others have been buried beneath layers of time, waiting to be uncovered. What if I told you that the world you know, the societies, the borders, even the way we think was shaped by horrors most people have never heard of? This is a journey into the shadows where the past isn't just prologue, it's a warning. Imagine standing at the edge of a crumbling empire, watching as a single decision spirals into catastrophe. Picture a quiet village where an unthinkable act ignites a chain reaction of violence that echoes for centuries. These aren't just stories, they're turning points, moments when the course of history bent toward darkness. From plagues that wiped out millions to conspiracies that toppled nations, the events we're about to explore didn't just change the world, they warped it. And yet, few people truly understand how deep the scars run. That's why we're diving into 30 of the most disturbing historical events ever recorded. Some will shock you, others might make you question everything you thought you knew. But one thing's certain, by the end, you'll see history in a new light, not as a distant series of events, but as forces that still shape our lives today. So steel yourself, because the past isn't as far away as it seems, and some truths are darker than fiction. The Black Death was unlike anything medieval Europe had ever seen, a nightmare made real. It began in the 1300s, creeping silently along trade routes from Asia until merchant ships carried it to Sicilian ports in 1347. Within months, the bubonic plague transformed bustling cities into graveyards. Victims suffered swollen, blackened lymph nodes called buboes, raging fevers, and hideous dark blotches under the skin. Death came swiftly, sometimes within days of the first symptoms, but the horror wasn't just in how people died, it was in how many. By 1351, 1 out of every 3 Europeans had vanished. Entire villages were wiped off the map, their names forgotten. Society unraveled at the seams, doctors fled their patients, priests abandoned their flocks, and families turned on each other in desperation. With no scientific understanding of germs, people grasped for explanations and found scapegoats. False rumors spread that Jews had poisoned wells, sparking brutal pogroms across the continent. Thousands were burned alive or driven from their homes, a chilling preview of the persecution to come in later centuries. Meanwhile, the sheer scale of death reshaped Europe's economy. With so many laborers gone, surviving workers could demand higher wages, shaking the foundations of feudalism. Yet from this darkness came unexpected change. The old order crumbled, making way for new ideas, new art, even new ways of thinking about human life. The Renaissance might never have dawned so brightly had the plague not cleared the path. But that's the cruel irony of history. Sometimes the most unimaginable suffering plants the seeds for rebirth. The Black Death didn't just kill millions, it forced the survivors to rebuild a world they no longer recognized. And in that rebuilding, they stumbled toward modernity. The Spanish Inquisition began in 1478 with a papal decree, but what followed was far from holy. What started as an attempt to root out heresy quickly became a machine of terror, fueled by paranoia and religious fanaticism. The first targets were conversos, Jewish and Muslim converts to Christianity accused of secretly practicing their old faith. But soon, no one was safe from suspicion. Neighbors denounced each other to save themselves. Friends disappeared in the night, dragged before tribunals where guilt was assumed before a single question was asked. The methods of interrogation were designed to break both body and spirit. Victims endured the strappado hoisted by their wrists tied behind their backs, dislocating shoulders as they dangled. Others faced the rack, limbs slowly stretched until joints tore apart. water torture filled lungs until confessing seemed merciful, and for those who refused to repent. Public burnings called autos da fe turned town squares into theaters of suffering, where spectators watched condemned souls writhe in flames. But the Inquisition's true horror wasn't just its brutality, it was how it weaponized faith. Torturers claimed they acted to save souls, twisting scripture into justification for cruelty. Centuries before modern totalitarianism, Spain perfected a system where fear kept people obedient. Even after executions declined, the damage lingered. Families lived with generational trauma, communities fractured by betrayal, and a legacy of religious intolerance that outlasted the Inquisition itself by centuries. Yet in its shadow, something unexpected took root. The very oppression meant to suppress dissent sparked resistance. Hidden synagogues in basement rooms, Qurans passed secretly between hands. Survival became its own rebellion, and when the Inquisition finally ended in 1834, it left behind not just scars, but a warning about what happens when absolute power claims divine right. Because faith without mercy isn't holiness, it's just another kind of tyranny. The Salem witch trials began with whispers, just children's games, some said. In the winter of 1692, 2 young girls in the Massachusetts Bay Colony started convulsing, screaming that invisible hands pinched and bit them. The local doctor, baffled by their fits, declared the only possible explanation, witchcraft, and with that diagnosis, a quiet Puritan village spiraled into madness. Accusations spread like wildfire. The girls pointed fingers at outcasts first, a slave named Tituba, a beggar woman, an outspoken widow, but soon no one was safe. Spectral evidence, dreams, and visions of the accused tormenting their victims became enough to condemn a person. A mere glance or muttered curse could land someone in chains. Neighbors turned on neighbors, families against families, as the terror took hold. The trials themselves were a grotesque parody of justice. Defendants faced impossible tests. If they floated when thrown into water, they were guilty. If they sank, they were innocent but often drowned. Confessions extracted under duress only fed the frenzy. By the end, 19 people had been hanged on Gallows Hill, 1 man pressed to death under heavy stones, and 5 more perished in jail. The youngest accused was just 4 years old. What makes Salem so chilling isn't just the executions, it's how ordinary people became executioners. God-fearing farmers, pious mothers, even respected judges all played a role in the hysteria. It was a perfect storm of superstition, repressed social tension, and the desperate need for control in a harsh, uncertain world. And here's the unsettling truth: Salem wasn't an anomaly. It was a blueprint. Throughout history, when fear takes hold, societies look for witches. Sometimes they wear pointy hats, other times they're immigrants, political dissidents, or anyone deemed different. The mechanisms are eerily similar: rumors treated as facts, fear overriding reason, and the desperate need to blame someone, anyone, for the chaos. Salem's legacy isn't just in the graves. It's in the warning that even the most civilized societies are just a few panicked whispers away from cruelty. The trials ended as suddenly as they began, leaving survivors to grapple with what they'd done. But the question lingers: if it happened then, in a village of devout believers, could it happen again? The transatlantic slave trade was history's most brutal forced migration, a centuries-long nightmare that reshaped continents. From the 1500s to the 1800s, European ships carried over 12 million Africans across the ocean in chains. But that staggering number hides the human horror behind it. Each digit represents a person ripped from their home, packed into the belly of a ship like cargo, and sold into a lifetime of bondage. The Middle Passage was where the cruelty reached unimaginable depths. Enslaved people were crammed shoulder to shoulder in suffocating holds, lying in their own waste as diseases spread unchecked. Many ships lost a third of their cargo to starvation, thirst, or suicide before reaching shore. Survivors described the stench of death clinging to the decks, the constant wails of grief, and the sharks that followed ships, feasting on bodies thrown overboard. Yet even in this hell, resistance flickered. Some staged desperate rebellions mid-voyage, like the Igbo uprising of 1803, where captives overwhelmed their captors and deliberately drowned their ship rather than submit. Others preserved fragments of their culture through whispered songs, hidden rituals, and secret languages, small acts of defiance that kept their identities alive. On plantations, slavery built empires. The sugar, tobacco, and cotton harvested by enslaved hands bankrolled Europe's industrial revolution and enriched colonial powers. But the system's true cost was measured in broken families, generations brutalized, and a racial hierarchy that poisoned societies for centuries. Then came Haiti. In 1791, enslaved people on the French colony of Saint-Domingue rose up in history's only successful slave revolt. Led by figures like Toussaint Louverture, they fought off French, British, and Spanish armies, declaring independence in 1804. The Haitian Revolution terrified slaveholders worldwide, proof that the oppressed could shatter their chains. But freedom came at a price. France demanded crippling reparations for lost property, plunging Haiti into debt that strangled its future. Meanwhile, other nations doubled down on slavery, fearing another Haiti. The trade finally ended in the 1800s, but its legacy lingers in systemic inequality, cultural erasure, and the unresolved wounds of racism. Because slavery wasn't just an economic system, it was a crime against humanity that still echoes today. The Rwandan genocide unfolded with a speed and brutality that shocked the world. 100 days of slaughter so efficient, it left 800,000 Tutsi men, women, and children dead. But this wasn't spontaneous violence. It was meticulously planned, fueled by decades of colonial engineered division between Hutus and Tutsis. The fuse was lit on April 6, 1994, when a plane carrying Rwanda's Hutu president was shot down. Within hours, roadblocks went up across the capital, Kigali. Lists of Tutsi families were distributed, and then the machetes came out. Radio stations played a sinister role. Broadcasts from outlets like Radio Television Libre des Mille Collines dehumanized Tutsis as cockroaches, urging Hutus to cut the tall trees, a coded call for extermination. Neighbors turned on neighbors, teachers killed students, even priests betrayed their congregations. Churches, typically sanctuaries, became slaughterhouses where thousands were hacked to death inside the very buildings where they'd sought refuge. The killers didn't just murder, they reveled in it, dancing atop corpses, looting homes, and leaving the country's rivers choked with bodies. What's perhaps most chilling is how the world looked away. The United Nations had peacekeepers on the ground, but their mandate was restricted to observing, not intervening. As pleas for help poured in, Western nations prioritized evacuating their own citizens over stopping the bloodshed. When Belgian soldiers, part of the UN force, were tortured and killed early in the genocide, foreign governments withdrew entirely, leaving Rwandans to their fate. The phrase "never again," coined after the Holocaust, rang hollow as the international community debated semantics while machetes rose and fell. Yet amid the horror, there were flashes of extraordinary courage. Some Hutus risked everything to hide Tutsi friends, like hotel manager Paul Rusesabagina, who sheltered over 1,000 in his establishment, bargaining with killers using whiskey and cash. Others smuggled children to safety under piles of corpses or lied to militias about the identities of those they hunted. These acts of defiance came at an unimaginable cost. Many rescuers were executed alongside those they tried to protect. When the genocide finally ended in July 1994, Rwanda was a nation of ghosts. Streets once bustling were silent except for the rustle of abandoned clothing caught in the wind. Orphans wandered days through villages where every adult had been killed, and the justice system lay in ruins. So many had participated in the killings that traditional courts couldn't possibly handle the caseload. The solution was something unprecedented. Gacaca courts, community-based tribunals where perpetrators confronted survivors face to face. Some confessed in exchange for reduced sentences. Others showed remorse by rebuilding homes they'd destroyed. It wasn't perfect justice. Many victims' families bristled at seeing killers walk free after admitting guilt, but it allowed a shattered society to begin stitching itself back together. Today, Rwanda is a study in contradictions. The same hills that once echoed with screams are now lush with coffee plantations and tech startups. The government enforces a strict policy of national unity, discouraging public discussion of ethnic divisions. But trauma doesn't vanish with laws. Survivors still pass mass graves on their way to work, and perpetrators live next door to the families they orphaned. The reconciliation is fragile, hard-won, and incomplete, a reminder that healing from such darkness takes generations, and that's the lesson seared into Rwanda's soil. Genocide doesn't happen because monsters descend from the sky. It happens when ordinary people are taught to see their neighbors as less than human, and when the world decides their lives aren't worth the cost of stopping it. The machetes may be silent now, but the silence itself is a warning. The Holocaust stands as humanity's most harrowing lesson in what happens when hatred is given absolute power. It began not with gas chambers, but with words, slow, deliberate dehumanization. Nazi ideology painted Jews as parasites, a cancer to be excised from the body of Germany. By the time the first trains rolled toward Auschwitz in 1941, years of propaganda had made the unthinkable seem necessary. What followed was a killing machine of chilling efficiency, where 6 million Jews, along with Roma, disabled individuals, and political dissidents were systematically erased from the earth. Auschwitz wasn't just a camp, it was an industrial complex designed for mass murder. Prisoners arrived under the grotesque lie of resettlement, only to face a brutal selection process on the platform. Those deemed unfit for labor, children, the elderly, pregnant women, were marched directly to the showers, which pumped out Zyklon B instead of water. The Nazis even harvested gold from victims' teeth and wove hair into textiles, turning genocide into a profit-driven enterprise. Survivors like Primo Levi later described the surreal horror of watching the chimneys spew ash that once breathed and dreamed, an entire people reduced to smoke. Yet amid this darkness, acts of defiance flickered like candle flames. Some prisoners secretly documented atrocities, burying notes in jars or stitching names into clothing. In the Warsaw Ghetto, Jewish fighters staged a desperate uprising, holding off Nazi troops for nearly a month with homemade weapons. These weren't just battles for survival, they were assertions of dignity in the face of annihilation. The liberation of the camps in 1945 exposed the full scope of the horror to a stunned world. Allied soldiers found skeletal figures clinging to life, piles of glasses and shoes that outnumbered the survivors, and crematoria still warm from their last loads. The Nuremberg trials that followed attempted to reckon with this evil, establishing for the first time that just following orders was no defense for crimes against humanity. Perhaps the Holocaust's most enduring legacy is the question it forces us to confront: how ordinary people become complicit in genocide. The bureaucrats who typed deportation lists, the neighbors who pointed out hidden attics, the nations that turned away refugee ships. None wielded a gun, yet all played a role. That's why survivor testimonies matter more than ever. When Elie Wiesel wrote of watching a boy hang slowly on the gallows, or when Anne Frank's diary captured a teenager's stolen dreams, they gave the numbers names and faces. The world vowed never again, but the echoes persist in genocides from Cambodia to Bosnia, in the rise of Holocaust denial, and in the quiet bigotries we still tolerate. The Holocaust didn't just redefine human rights, it held up a mirror to our capacity for cruelty. And that reflection remains the most disturbing warning history has ever given us. The Armenian Genocide unfolded not in the fog of war, but as a meticulously planned eradication. In 1915, as World War I raged, the Ottoman Empire turned its fury inward, targeting its Christian Armenian population with a cruelty that defied reason. What began with the arrest and execution of 250 Armenian intellectuals in Constantinople quickly escalated into a continent-spanning slaughter. Death marches through the Syrian desert became rolling graveyards, families forced to walk without food or water until they collapsed, their bodies left to bake under the sun. Others were herded into caves and burned alive, drowned in rivers, or slaughtered in mass shootings so vast that rivers ran red for days. By 1917, 1.5 million Armenians had been erased from their ancestral lands, their homes looted, their churches desecrated, their very existence denied. This wasn't chaos, it was policy. Ottoman documents later revealed chilling orders referring to Armenians as the internal tumor, with directives to cleanse regions of their presence. Special killing squads called the Teşkilat-i Mahsusa were deployed to carry out the atrocities, while propaganda painted Armenians as traitors to justify the horrors. Survivors recounted mothers smothering their own babies to silence them during hunts, entire villages committing mass suicide rather than falling into Ottoman hands, and orphaned children stumbling alone through the wilderness. The few who escaped carried stories so grotesque that diplomats at the time called it race murder, a term that would later evolve into genocide, yet the tragedy didn't end with the killings. The systematic denial that followed became a second death. Modern Turkey, inheritor of the Ottoman legacy, still refuses to acknowledge the genocide, spending millions on lobbying and censorship to suppress the historical record. School textbooks omit the events, mentioning Armenians only as rebels. Politicians who dare use the word genocide face criminal charges under laws forbidding insults to Turkishness. This denial isn't just about the past, it's a geopolitical weapon. When the United States finally recognized the genocide in 2021 after a century of hesitation, Turkey retaliated with threats of economic sanctions and cancelled diplomatic meetings. The implications stretch far beyond Armenia. Denial sets a dangerous precedent, a blueprint for how to commit atrocity without consequence. When a state can erase history, it emboldens others to do the same. We've seen the echoes in Cambodia's Killing Fields, in Darfur's burned villages, in the Rohingyas' flight from Myanmar. Each time, the world's delayed response is haunted by the same question. If we couldn't even call the Armenian genocide by its name, how can we prevent the next one? What makes this chapter especially chilling is how ordinary people became instruments of destruction. Ottoman soldiers posed for trophy photos with their victims, smiling beside pyramids of skulls. Neighbors turned on neighbors, seizing Armenian property as spoils. The genocide proved how quickly humanity's thin veneer of civilization can crack under the weight of hatred and impunity. But there's another story here, one of stubborn survival. Despite every effort to exterminate them, Armenians endured. Diaspora communities kept their language and traditions alive from Los Angeles to Beirut. In 2020, when Azerbaijan attacked Armenian territory using Turkish-made drones, the world finally heard Armenia's cry. This is what happens when genocide goes unpunished. Because history isn't just about what was lost, it's about what refuses to die. The Armenian genocide isn't a footnote. It's a warning written in blood, one that the world still struggles to read. The Khmer Rouge didn't just seize power in Cambodia, they declared war on reality itself. On April 17, 1975, as their troops marched into Phnom Penh, they announced the dawn of Year Zero, a brutal reset where history, culture, and even family ties would be obliterated in the name of a peasant utopia. Within hours, soldiers emptied the capital at gunpoint, forcing 2 million people, doctors, teachers, children, the elderly, into the countryside with nothing but the clothes on their backs. Hospitals were abandoned mid-surgery, cars left running in the streets, pets shot as bourgeois decadence. The cities Pol Pot decreed were cesspools of corruption. The rice fields would purify Cambodia's soul. What followed was a nightmare of industrialized madness. The Khmer Rouge targeted anyone with education, wearing glasses, or speaking a foreign language could mark you for death. Teachers were buried alive with their chalkboards. Musicians had their fingers broken before execution. At Chuol Sleng Prison, a converted high school renamed S21, 17,000 inmates passed through its gates. Only 12 walked out alive. The prison's meticulous records survive: black and white photos of hollow-eyed prisoners chained to iron beds, forced to confess absurd crimes like plotting with the CIA before being bludgeoned to death at the Killing Fields. Some confessions ran to hundreds of pages, extracted through days of electrocution or having fingernails torn out with pliers. The Killing Fields became Cambodia's open-air graves. At Choang Ek, mass graves held layers of bodies, some with skulls shattered by rifle butts to save bullets, others still clutching their children. The Khmer Rouge even slaughtered babies by swinging them against trees, believing they'd grow up to seek revenge. By 1979, when Vietnamese forces toppled the regime, nearly 2 million Cambodians, a quarter of the population, had vanished. Rice harvests failed because the agricultural revolution was led by teenagers who'd never farmed. People ate bark, insects, even their own dead to survive. Yet the most chilling aspect wasn't the scale of violence, it was the ideology behind it. Pol Pot's cotters genuinely believed they were building paradise. Children were taken from parents to be raised as revolutionaries, taught to report traitorous relatives. Marriages were arranged by committee, couples paired like livestock. Money was abolished, religion banned, even laughter deemed suspicious. The regime turned Cambodia into a nation of ghosts where trust itself became lethal. Today, trees at Choang Ek still push bone fragments to the surface after heavy rains. At Chuol Sleng, bloodstains streak classroom floors where blackboards once stood. The Khmer Rouge trials, delayed for decades, delivered scant justice before the last leaders died. But survivors carry the scars, not just on their bodies, but in the silence where generations of thinkers, artists, and storytellers should have been. The Killing Fields didn't just take lives, they stole a country's future. And that's the ultimate warning of extremism. When you destroy the past to remake the world, all you're left with is graves. The Great Chinese Famine wasn't just a tragedy, it was a man-made catastrophe disguised as progress. In 1958, Mao Zedong launched the Great Leap Forward, promising to transform China into an industrial powerhouse overnight. Peasants were ordered to melt down their cooking pots to fuel backyard furnaces, producing useless lumps of pig iron while crops rotted in the fields. Local officials, terrified of being labeled rightists, competed to report impossible harvests to Beijing, claiming wheat yields 20 times higher than reality. The government, believing its own lies, seized grain based on these fantasies, leaving villagers with nothing to eat. By 1959, the land that had fed China for millennia was silent, its people reduced to eating tree bark, clay, and in some of the most harrowing cases, each other. Starvation twisted morality into unrecognizable shapes. Survivors described ghost villages where the weak collapsed mid-step, their bodies left unburied because no one had the strength to dig. Mothers smothered their own infants to spare them slow agony. Cannibalism, once unthinkable, became a whispered reality, desperate families trading human flesh in underground markets, some even exhuming graves. Party cotters dining in well-stocked canteens dismissed these reports as bourgeois slander. The truth was buried deeper than the bodies. Mao's policies didn't just fail, they weaponized ideology against survival. When scientists warned that uprooting trees for furnaces would cause erosion, they were purged as counter-revolutionaries. Farmers who hid grain from confiscation teams were executed as saboteurs. The party insisted nature could be conquered through sheer revolutionary will, even as children's bellies swelled from protein deficiency. By the time the famine ended in 1961, between 30 and 45 million people had perished, more than the Holocaust and Stalin's purges combined. Yet, unlike those atrocities the world barely noticed, China was sealed off, foreign journalists expelled, and survivors terrorized into silence. Decades later, the Communist Party still whitewashes this history. School textbooks blame natural disasters and Soviet betrayal, erasing Mao's culpability. When archives briefly opened in the 1980s, scholars estimated the death toll, only for the government to confiscate their research. Even today, mentioning the famine online triggers censorship algorithms, but memories outlast propaganda. In Henan province, elderly villagers still point to barren hillsides and say, "This is where we buried the children." The famine's true legacy isn't just in the missing millions, it's in the warning it offers about blind obedience to ideology. When leaders value slogans over lives, when dissent is treason and truth is inconvenient, the result isn't progress. It's mass graves hidden beneath fields of forced smiles. The Crusades were sold as holy wars to reclaim Jerusalem for Christendom, but the reality was far uglier than the myth. When Pope Urban Roman II called for the First Crusade in 1095, he promised participants forgiveness of sins and eternal glory. What he didn't mention were the rivers of blood that would stain the campaign from its very first steps. Before Crusaders even reached the Holy Land, they turned their swords on Jewish communities across Europe, slaughtering thousands in the Rhineland. Entire neighborhoods were burned alive in their synagogues, children trampled under charging horses, and survivors forcibly baptized, all under the rallying cry of "God wills it." When they finally reached Jerusalem in 1099, the carnage reached apocalyptic levels. Crusaders breached the walls after a grueling siege and unleashed a frenzy of violence so extreme even medieval chroniclers were horrified. Muslim men, women, and children were butchered in the streets, their bodies piled high in the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Jews who sought refuge in their synagogue were burned alive inside it. Eyewitnesses described Crusaders wading ankle-deep in blood, slaughtering so indiscriminately that horses slipped on the gore. The city's wells were reportedly choked with corpses for weeks afterward. This wasn't liberation, it was extermination. Yet the Crusades' darkest legacy might be their long shadow. The rhetoric of holy war justified atrocities for centuries, from the Spanish Inquisition to the 30 Years' War. Even today, jihadist groups and far-right extremists invoke Crusader imagery to justify violence, twisting history into propaganda. Al-Qaeda's Osama bin Laden explicitly framed the 9/11 attacks as revenge for medieval Crusader crimes, while white supremacists tout Crusader symbols as emblems of racial purity. Both sides ignoring the inconvenient truth that Crusader armies included Muslim allies and slaughtered fellow Christians when convenient. The real tragedy of the Crusades isn't just the lives lost, it's how they poisoned interfaith relations for generations. Medieval Muslim scholars once saw Christianity as a cousin faith, but after watching Crusader knights desecrate mosques with entrails, that tolerance curdled into bitterness. Jewish communities, though accustomed to persecution, faced new levels of organized violence under the cross, and the Crusader states themselves became colonial experiments, proving how easily piety could mask greed. Most Crusaders cared less about holy sites than seizing land and wealth. But here's what textbooks often omit. The Crusades weren't a clash of civilizations. They were a messy, shifting conflict where alliances crossed religious lines constantly. Muslim leaders like Saladin showed remarkable mercy compared to their Christian counterparts, famously offering safe passage to surrendering foes. Arab chroniclers noted Crusader knights who converted to Islam, Muslim mercenaries fighting for Christian kings, and trading partnerships that flourished even during wartime. The real story isn't East versus West. It's how power corrupts any cause, sacred or secular. That's why the Crusades still matter. They remind us how easily faith can be weaponized, how myths outlive facts, and how violence justified by divine mandate never stays contained. When modern conflicts flare in the Middle East or hate crimes spike in the West, the ghost of the Crusaders' sword still hangs overhead, because holy war isn't history, it's a warning stuck on repeat. The Trail of Tears wasn't just a forced march, it was the brutal endpoint of a decades-long campaign of theft disguised as law. In 1830, President Andrew Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act, a piece of legislation that masqueraded as compromise while authorizing ethnic cleansing. The Cherokee Nation, one of the so-called 5 civilized tribes, had already adopted European-style farming, built schools, even created a written language. None of it mattered. Gold had been discovered on their land in Georgia, and white settlers wanted it. The Supreme Court ruled in the Cherokees' favor, but Jackson famously sneered, "John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it." With that, the rule of law unraveled. What followed was a slow-motion massacre. Cherokee families were dragged from their homes at gunpoint, their possessions looted by militias as they watched. Concentration camps sprang up where thousands languished through a scorching summer, drinking from malaria-infested ponds. When the forced marches began in 1838, the cruelty became methodical. Government contractors, paid by the head to relocate Native Americans, cut every possible corner, providing rancid food, rotten blankets, and wagons that broke down within miles. Elders and children died first, their bodies left unburied beside frozen trails as snow fell on open eyes. The numbers defy comprehension. Of the approximately 16,000 Cherokee forced westward, an estimated 4,000 perished, a death rate higher than many battles. But the Trail of Tears was just one route in a network of suffering. The Choctaw lost 1,500 to exposure in Arkansas's swamps. Creek refugees were marched in chains after resisting expulsion. Seminoles who fled into Florida's Everglades waged a guerrilla war for 7 years rather than surrender. This wasn't destiny, it was policy. Settler hunger for land drove the violence, but racist pseudoscience gave it intellectual cover. Prominent thinkers like Thomas Jefferson had long argued natives were noble savages doomed to vanish before superior white civilization. Jackson's administration weaponized this myth, casting removal as kindness to spare tribes from annihilation. The reality, maps from the era show Indian territory shrinking year by year as politicians broke treaties almost as fast as they were signed. The scars never faded. Descendants still recount family stories of ancestors who walked the trail cradling heirloom seeds in their palms, the only piece of home they could carry. Others trace their lineage to the few hundred Cherokee who hid in the Smoky Mountains, becoming the Eastern Band. But the greatest tragedy lies in what was lost beyond lives, languages, medicines, whole ways of understanding the world. When the U.S. government later established boarding schools to kill the Indian, save the man, it proved removal was never just about land, it was about erasure. Today, roadside signs along the Trail of Tears route gesture at remembrance, but the deeper reckoning remains unfinished. Cities like Chicago and Nashville sit on land ceded under duress. The very name Trail of Tears sanitizes the horror, a phrase coined by whites, not the Cherokee, who call it the trail where they cried. That disconnect speaks volumes. Because America's origin story isn't just pilgrims and pioneers, it's stacked bones along forgotten roads, and the echoes of a question we still avoid. How much of this nation was built not on freedom but on graves? At 5:15 in the morning on August 6, 1945, a single American B-29 bomber named Enola Gay released a weapon unlike any the world had seen. The uranium bomb, nicknamed Little Boy, took 43 seconds to fall toward Hiroshima. When it detonated 600 meters above the city, the blast equaled 15,000 tons of TNT, obliterating everything within a 2-kilometer radius in a single, searing flash. Survivors near ground zero simply vaporized, leaving only eerie shadows burned onto walls where their bodies once stood. Further out, people exposed to the thermal wave had their skin melt off in sheets, while others were impaled by flying glass or crushed beneath collapsing buildings. The firestorm that followed sucked oxygen from the air, asphyxiating those trapped in rubble. By day's end, at least 70,000 were dead. 3 days later, Nagasaki faced its own apocalypse when the plutonium bomb, Fat Man, leveled the city, killing another 40,000 instantly. But the horror didn't end with the explosions. The bombs unleashed an invisible killer radiation. Victims who initially seemed unharmed developed grotesque symptoms within days: purple skin spots, hair falling out in clumps, bleeding gums. Hospitals overflowed with patients dying from internal hemorrhaging as their white blood cells vanished. Pregnant women who survived later gave birth to babies with microcephaly or missing limbs. The term hibakusha, meaning explosion-affected people, became a lifelong curse as survivors faced discrimination from employers and potential spouses who feared they'd pass on mutations. Even decades later, leukemia rates in Hiroshima remained 10 times higher than the national average, proving radiation's poison was generational. The ethical debate still rages. Supporters argue the bombings forced Japan's surrender, potentially saving millions of lives that would have been lost in a prolonged invasion. Declassified documents suggest some Japanese leaders were already seeking peace, though hardliners refused to surrender unconditionally. Critics counter that targeting civilians, including thousands of Korean forced laborers and Allied POWs in the cities, crossed a moral line. The Nagasaki bombing in particular seems harder to justify, coming so soon after Hiroshima and before Japan had time to process the first attack. Even some Manhattan Project scientists petitioned against using the bomb without warning, proposing a demonstration detonation instead. Hibakusha testimonies cut through the abstraction. Michiko Hachiya's diary describes stumbling through a city of charred corpses sitting in streetcars, forever holding the straps. A Nagasaki survivor named Sumitoru Taniguchi spent 3 years lying on his stomach after the blast burned the skin off his back, leaving raw muscle exposed. Others recount searching for relatives in piles of bodies so disfigured they could only recognize them by a belt buckle or a scrap of clothing. These weren't strategic targets, they were school children, streetcar conductors, mothers hanging laundry. Perhaps the most haunting legacy is how these bombings normalized the unthinkable. The mushroom cloud became a political tool during the Cold War, a specter hanging over every conflict since. The Hibakusha's messenger, "No more Hiroshimas," echoes as nuclear arsenals grow more sophisticated. Because the real question isn't just whether the bombs were justified in 1945. It's whether humanity can afford to keep playing with fire that leaves shadows where people used to be. The partition of India was supposed to be a triumphant birth, a chance for millions to step free from British rule. Instead, it became one of history's bloodiest divorces. When the clock struck midnight on August 15, 1947, two nations gasped into existence, India and Pakistan, torn from the same soil. But the hastily drawn border, scrawled by a British lawyer who'd never set foot in South Asia, ignored rivers, villages, even families. What followed wasn't just migration. It was an eruption of violence so savage that survivors still whisper about it decades later. Trains packed with refugees arrived at stations silent as tombs, every passenger slaughtered mid-journey. Entire carriages dripped blood onto the tracks, earning them the grim nickname "ghost trains." By the time the killing subsided, 1 million lay dead, and 15 million had become homeless overnight, the largest forced migration in human history. This wasn't just political chaos, it was intimate horror. Women became battlegrounds in a war of ideologies. Tens of thousands were kidnapped, raped, or forced into marriages with their families' killers. Some Sikh and Hindu women threw themselves into wells rather than face abduction, an act remembered as martyrdom. Pakistani and Indian governments later launched recovery missions to return these women, but many refused to go back, unwilling to relive the trauma or face shame in their communities. The violence wasn't spontaneous, it was incited. Rumors spread like wildfire that Muslims had poisoned water wells or that Sikhs were hoarding weapons. Mobs armed with farming tools and gasoline made sure revenge was communal, burning neighborhoods while survivors fled with nothing but the clothes on their backs. Kashmir remains partition's festering wound. The princely state's Hindu ruler chose India despite a Muslim-majority population, sparking wars in 1947, 1965, and 1999. Even today, the line of control divides families who haven't seen each other in 75 years. Villagers on opposite sides shout across the border during ceasefire lulls, their voices carrying further than their passports ever could. The conflict has turned Kashmir into the world's most militarized zone, where daily life is punctuated by checkpoints and curfews, yet amid the ruins, unexpected kindness flickered. A Muslim family sheltering Sikh neighbors here, a Hindu doctor saving wounded Pakistani refugees there. These small acts defied the madness. The survivors who rebuilt their lives carried more than scars, they carried stories. Urdu poets like Saadat Hasan Manto documented the absurd cruelty in searing prose, asking who the real barbarians were, those who killed or those who drew the lines. Partition didn't end in 1947. It echoes in cricket rivalries that turned stadiums into battlefields, in border ceremonies where soldiers stomped their boots with exaggerated fury, in the way grandparents still lower their voices when recalling that time. The division proved that freedom can come at too high a price, and that when empires leave, they don't clean up their mess, they just draw a line and call it history. The French Revolution began with idealism, liberty, equality, fraternity scrawled on banners as the Bastille fell. But by 1793, those noble dreams curdled into something far darker. Enter Maximilien Robespierre, the lawyer-turned-revolutionary who became the architect of the Reign of Terror. What started as a movement to overthrow tyranny birthed its own monstrous twin, a system where suspicion was evidence and the guillotine never rested. Paris's streets ran slick with blood as the revolution turned inward, devouring its children with the same fervor it had once reserved for kings. Robespierre's Committee of Public Safety justified the carnage as necessary medicine for a sick nation. Enemies of the revolution, real or imagined, were dragged before hastily assembled tribunals where trials lasted minutes and acquittals were rarer than snow in July. The charges read like absurdist theater: a woman executed for mourning her husband too loudly, a farmer for hiding grain from requisition squads, even revolutionary hero Georges Danton himself, who dared question the terror's excesses before meeting the blade. The guillotine, that national razor, became the great leveler aristocrats and shoemakers knelt equally beneath its falling weight. At its peak, executions became public entertainment, with Parisians knitting as heads tumbled into wicker baskets like macabre cabbages at a market stall. Yet the true horror wasn't the body count, it was how easily ideals corrupted. Robespierre, who once railed against the death penalty, now saw virtue in slaughter. His infamous speech on virtue and terror laid bare the paradox. Terror is nothing other than justice, prompt, severe, inflexible. The revolution's lofty goals had become a license for paranoia, where anyone could be denounced by a neighbor's whisper. Even the calendar was reinvented, months renamed to erase Christian influence as churches were looted and priests lynched. The terror's end came as suddenly as its beginning. When Robespierre finally overreached, ordering executions without trial in July 1794, his own colleagues turned on him. His jaw shattered by a pistol shot during arrest, he faced the guillotine the next day without trial, the crowd cheering as his head joined the pile he'd made. The irony was lost on no one. The high priest of the terror had become its last victim, but the legacy lingered. the revolution proved how quickly liberation can twist into oppression, how absolute certainty breeds monsters. Modern dictatorships from Stalin's purges to the Khmer Rouge would replay this grim script, revolutions eating their own, always in the name of purity. The guillotine's shadow warns us still no cause is so righteous it can't be weaponized, no ideology immune to the poison of its own power. The streets of Nanjing ran red for 6 weeks in 1937 as Japanese Imperial Army troops turned China's capital into a slaughterhouse. What began as a military occupation quickly descended into an orgy of violence so extreme it shocked even hardened foreign observers. Eyewitness accounts describe Japanese soldiers using prisoners for bayonet practice, forcing families to watch as they raped daughters in front of fathers, and stacking corpses into pyramids that smoldered for days. The Nanjing massacre wasn't just a battle, it was the systematic dehumanization of an entire city. The horror unfolded with methodical brutality. After capturing Nanjing in December, Japanese commanders effectively gave their troops free rein. Soldiers competed in killing contests, with newspapers back home celebrating officers who racked up triple-digit body counts. Western missionaries and businessmen sheltered in the international safety zone watched as Japanese troops ignored its borders, dragging women from refugee camps to be gang-raped before mutilation. One German businessman documented over 20,000 rape cases in the first month alone, noting many victims were then murdered to eliminate witnesses. Even children and elderly women weren't spared. Some were tied to beds and assaulted until they died of trauma, but the cruelty wasn't random, it was policy. Japan's military culture viewed surrender as shameful, and Chinese soldiers who laid down arms were seen as unworthy of mercy. Civilians fared no better, with imperial propaganda depicting them as less than human. Survivors recalled being forced to drink sewage or kneel beside mass graves before execution. Some were doused in gasoline and set alight for amusement, their screams drowned out by soldiers' laughter. The death toll remains disputed. Chinese estimates reach 300,000, while Japanese revisionists claim far fewer, but the mountains of bones uncovered in post-war excavations tell their own story. What makes Nanjing particularly chilling is how Japan has wrestled, or failed to wrestle, with this history. Unlike Germany's reckoning with Nazi crimes, Japan's education system often glosses over wartime atrocities. Textbooks refer euphemistically to an incident, and politicians periodically visit Tokyo's Yasukuni Shrine, where convicted war criminals are enshrined as martyrs. When the massacre's few surviving victims speak out, far-right groups harass them as liars. This denial isn't just about the past, it fuels tensions with China to this day, where Nanjing remains a national symbol of victimhood. Yet there are cracks in the silence. Some Japanese journalists and scholars have risked careers to document the truth, unearthing diaries where soldiers confessed to atrocities. One veteran wrote of how his unit bayoneted a farmer, then realized too late the man's toddler was still clinging to his corpse. Another described throwing babies into the air and catching them on his sword, a game his comrades applauded. These testimonies, buried for decades, forced Japan to confront an uncomfortable question. How could ordinary men become monsters? The answer lies in what Nanjing reveals about all of us. Given license to kill without consequence, fed propaganda that erases empathy, even decent people can commit unspeakable acts. That's why the massacre isn't just China's tragedy, it's humanity's warning. When we strip others of their dignity, we don't just destroy them, we destroy ourselves. The Irish potato famine wasn't just a tragedy of nature, it was a crime of indifference. When potato blight first blackened Ireland's fields in 1845, it doomed a population already living on the edge. A third of the island relied on potatoes as their sole food source, thanks to centuries of British policies that pushed tenant farmers onto smaller, poorer plots. But what turned crop failure into catastrophe was Westminster's response, or lack thereof. As Irish peasants starved, London officials clung to laissez-faire dogma, refusing to halt food exports from Ireland or meaningfully intervene. Prime Minister Lord John Russell insisted markets would correct themselves, while Treasury Secretary Charles Trevelyan called the famine an effective mechanism for reducing surplus population. Behind these cold calculations lay a deeper contempt, the widespread British belief that the Irish were lazy, backward, and somehow deserving of their fate. Starvation reshaped bodies and minds. Survivors described eating grass, seaweed, even the blood of their own livestock after butchering them. Fever sheds overflowed with skeletal figures covered in sores, their bellies grotesquely swollen from malnutrition. Newspapers carried ads for famine-proof boots reinforced with metal to prevent the starving from chewing the leather. Meanwhile, landlords evicted nearly 500,000 penniless tenants, burning their cottages to prevent return. Some estates hired crowbar brigades to demolish homes with families still inside. The roads filled with wandering strollers, entire families collapsing where they fell. Local officials reported infants abandoned on beaches where mothers waded into the sea to drown. America became the promised land for those who could scrape together passage. Over 1 million Irish fled on disease-ridden coffin ships, where typhus and dysentery sometimes killed more passengers than survived. Those who reached Boston or New York faced fresh brutality. Help-wanted ads ended with "No Irish need apply," while Protestant mobs burned Catholic churches in Philadelphia. Cartoonists depicted Irish immigrants as ape-like drunkards stealing jobs from real Americans. Yet these refugees would reshape the nation, filling factories, building railroads, and eventually clawing their way into politics. The famine diaspora created an Irish America that never forgot who let its people starve. The famine's end brought no justice. British relief efforts were always too little, too late. Soup kitchens that closed when the worst was over, public works projects that paid starvation wages. When the blight finally receded in 1852, Ireland had lost a quarter of its population, 1 million dead, another 2 million gone. The empty cottages and fallow fields stood as silent rebukes to an empire that could have saved them. Modern research confirms Ireland actually produced enough grain during the famine to feed its people, but most was exported under armed guard to England. What lingers isn't just the horror, but the question it forces us to confront: when does neglect become genocide? The British state didn't create the blight, but its policies turned disaster into annihilation. The famine proved how easily prejudice can mask murder, not with guns, but with account books and economic theory. And in Irish memory, it remains an open wound, not just for the lives lost, but for the generations that might have been. The morning of March 16, 1968, should have been like any other in the Vietnamese village of My Lai, women cooking breakfast, children chasing chickens through the dirt lanes, old men sipping tea in the hazy dawn light. Instead, it became the site of one of the most infamous war crimes in modern history. American soldiers from Charlie Company, traumatized by weeks of guerrilla attacks and booby traps, entered the hamlet not as liberators but as executioners. Over the next 4 hours, they slaughtered 500 unarmed civilians, grandmothers shot in their beds, infants tossed into wells, families machine-gunned as they clutched each other in irrigation ditches. One soldier would later testify that his comrades raped a teenage girl before murdering her with a rifle blast to the head. Another described villagers being herded into a drainage canal and systematically gunned down by Lieutenant William Calley's platoon while he calmly reloaded his M16. What stopped the massacre from being buried wasn't military justice, it was the conscience of one man. Army helicopter pilot Hugh Thompson and his crew spotted the carnage from above and landed their chopper between soldiers and fleeing villagers. Thompson ordered his door gunner to train weapons on his fellow Americans, threatening to open fire if they continued killing civilians. Later, he personally evacuated a bleeding child from a ditch full of corpses, ignoring orders to stop interfering. For decades, Thompson was vilified as a traitor by veterans groups, while Calley served just 3 years of house arrest for his role. Only in 1998 did Thompson receive the Soldier's Medal, the Army's highest award for bravery not involving combat. The cover-up began before the bodies were cold. Commanders initially reported My Lai as a victory against Viet Cong fighters, awarding the unit commendations. It took investigative journalist Seymour Hersh working off tips from disillusioned soldiers to expose the truth a full year later. The Army's official inquiry, led by General William Pearse, eventually confirmed the atrocities but shielded higher-ranking officers from accountability. Of the 26 men initially charged, only Calley faced conviction, his sentence later commuted by President Nixon after public outcry from those who saw him as a scapegoat. My Lai's legacy isn't just in the bloodstains that still darken that Vietnamese soil. It revealed how easily ordinary men, many of them drafted teenagers, could become monsters when dehumanization meets unchecked power. Veterans who participated later described snapping after weeks of stress and racist indoctrination that painted all villagers as Viet Cong sympathizers. The military's subsequent reforms, like mandatory war crimes training and tighter rules of engagement, couldn't erase the deeper lesson that every army carries the seeds of its own My Lai. The only variable is who steps forward to say no. Thompson's heroism, along with the chilling banality of the killer's phrases like "waste the gooks," forces us to confront war's ugliest truth. There are no clean battles, only choices, and in that Vietnamese village, 500 souls paid the price for one company's choice to see them as less than human. The question My Lai leaves us with isn't just how could this happen, it's how many more happened that we'll never know about. Because when history is written by the winners, the ditches stay full, the medals keep shining, and the ghosts keep whispering. The Spanish flu didn't creep into the world, it exploded. In the spring of 1918, as World War I raged, soldiers in Kansas began collapsing with a fever so violent it turned their skin blue. Within weeks, the virus hitched rides on troop ships and railroads, circling the globe with terrifying speed. But this wasn't just another flu. Victims drowned from the inside, their lungs filling with bloody foam as oxygen deprivation darkened their faces, a symptom survivors called Black Death. The healthy died fastest, their robust immune systems triggering catastrophic cytokine storms that ravaged organs. By winter, bodies stacked up so quickly cities ran out of coffins. Philadelphia resorted to steam shovels to dig mass graves, while in Spain, where neutral press reported freely, giving the pandemic its misleading name, newspapers carried obituaries in columns 10 pages long. Misinformation spread faster than the virus itself. Officials downplayed the threat to maintain wartime morale, dismissing it as three-day fever. Newspapers blamed German spies for poisoning aspirin or claimed wearing onions could ward off infection. Sound familiar? The parallels to COVID-19 are unsettling. A century apart, both pandemics saw quack cures flourish, from 1918's toxic mercury injections to 2020's bleach drinking conspiracy theories. The Spanish flu even had its own anti-maskers. San Francisco's Anti-Mask League protested face coverings as government overreach, while Chicago's health commissioner called masks the most unconscionable robbing of personal liberty. The same debates played out decades later, proving how little we'd learned. Yet the Spanish flu's deadliest weapon wasn't the virus, it was silence. Wartime censorship buried reports to avoid damaging morale, leaving cities unprepared when the second, deadlier wave hit. Philadelphia threw a massive Liberty Loan parade days before hospitals overflowed, turning the event into a super-spreader that killed 12,000 in weeks. Meanwhile, colonial powers like India suffered doubly. British authorities prioritized treating Europeans, while local populations perished in staggering numbers. Nearly 20 million died in India alone, their deaths often unrecorded in official counts. The pandemic vanished as mysteriously as it appeared by 1920, but its scars lingered. Orphans roamed streets in plague masks, and survivors battled sleeping sickness for years. Scientists later discovered the virus had jumped from birds to humans, mutating into a killer strain, a warning we ignored until COVID reminded us. The Spanish flu didn't just steal lives, it stole memory. Unlike wars, pandemics leave no monuments, only whispers in medical journals and family stories of grandparents who never came home. And that's the real tragedy, not just the 50 million who died, but how quickly the world forgot them until the next plague came knocking. The streets of Paris were eerily quiet in the pre-dawn hours of August 24, 1572, St. Bartholomew's Day. Then the church bells began to toll. It wasn't a call to prayer, but a signal for slaughter. Catholic mobs armed with knives, pikes, and torches burst into the homes of Huguenots, French Protestants, dragging families into the streets and butchering them where they stood. The Seine River choked with bodies, its currents carrying the dead downstream for days. What began as a targeted assassination of Huguenot leaders spiraled into a citywide bloodbath, spreading to other towns like wildfire. By the time the killing subsided, 10,000 lay dead, their only crime worshipping differently. This wasn't spontaneous rage, it was orchestrated terror. Queen Catherine de' Medici, mother of the young King Charles IX, had secretly approved the violence to crush Protestant political influence. When the first murders sparked panic, she leaned into the chaos, ordering city gates locked to prevent escapes. Catholic neighbors turned on Huguenot neighbors, some settling petty grudges under the guise of piety. One eyewitness described a group of children playing in a courtyard moments before assassins descended, their laughter cut short by swords. Another account tells of a Huguenot nobleman, the Admiral de Coligny, whose body was mutilated and paraded through Paris before being hung from the gallows at Montfaucon. The killers weren't just destroying lives, they were sending a message: dissent would be drowned in blood. Yet the massacre's true legacy wasn't in the bodies, but in the seismic shift it triggered. The violence shocked even Catholic Europe, hardening Protestant resolve and prolonging France's wars of religion for decades. Philosophers like Michel de Montaigne, who witnessed the carnage, began questioning whether any faith could justify such cruelty. Their writings planted early seeds of secularism, the radical idea that state power shouldn't hinge on religious dogma. The massacre also exposed the dirty secret of religious wars. They were rarely just about God. Land grabs, political rivalries, and personal vendettas all hid behind the veil of holy war. The tragedy forced Europe to confront an uncomfortable truth: that zealotry, left unchecked, could unravel civilization itself. Over time, this realization birthed concepts like religious tolerance and separation of church and state, though the road there would be paved with more bloodshed. St. Bartholomew's Day proved that when you mix absolute faith with absolute power, the result isn't salvation. It's rivers running red, and a world that must painfully relearn the value of mercy. Under the guise of philanthropy, King Leopold II of Belgium unleashed one of history's most brutal colonial regimes, a horror show disguised as humanitarianism. In 1885, as European powers carved up Africa at the Berlin Conference, Leopold secured personal ownership of the Congo Free State, a territory 76 times larger than Belgium. His propaganda painted it as a civilizing mission to end Arab slave trading. The reality, a rubber-fueled killing machine that turned the Congo into a graveyard. The system ran on two words: rubber quotas. European demand for bicycle and automobile tires sent prices skyrocketing, and Leopold's agents imposed impossible collection targets on Congolese villages. Failure meant punishment beyond imagination. Soldiers of the Force Publique, a mercenary army of conscripted Africans and white officers, marched into communities, demanding severed hands as proof each bullet they fired had killed a rebel rather than wasted on game. Villages that missed quotas had their right hands hacked off: men, women, children. Some were still twitching when tossed into smoking piles. others survived mutilation only to die of infection, their stumps wrapped in leaves. Missionary photographs from the era show rows of hollow-eyed survivors holding their own amputated hands, forced to pose as warnings, but hands were just the beginning. The force publique burned recalcitrant villages with families locked inside. Hostage-taking became routine. Women starved in captivity until male relatives delivered enough rubber. One officer, Leon Fieves, boasted of turning a district of 40,000 into 6,000 through systematic terror. Another, Captain Rom, decorated his flower beds with skulls. The atrocities weren't rogue actions, they were policy. Leopold's private correspondence gloated over profits while dismissing mortality reports as exaggerations. His administrators paid bonuses based on rubber yields, incentivizing cruelty. The result, a death toll surpassing 10 million from violence, starvation, and disease, half the Congo's population. What chills the blood isn't just the scale of suffering, but how meticulously it was hidden. Leopold commissioned statues portraying himself as a benevolent builder king, while censoring reports of atrocities. Journalists who exposed the truth, like Edmund Maule and Roger Casement, faced smear campaigns. It took 23 years of mounting evidence before international outrage forced Belgium to seize the colony from Leopold in 1908, not to free the Congolese but to salvage Belgium's reputation. The Congo's rubber terror laid bare colonialism's core lie. That empire was about enlightenment, not extraction. Every bicycle tire, every factory belt, every early car that rolled off European assembly lines was slick with Congolese blood. And the echoes linger. Belgium only returned Patrice Lumumba's gold tooth, ripped from his corpse after a 1961 CIA-backed assassination in 2022. Museums still display looted artifacts as gifts, not spoils. Perhaps the most haunting legacy is how ordinary people became complicit. Belgian citizens bought rubber shares without asking how dividends were earned. Scientists studied severed hands without questioning why they'd been severed. The Congo Free State proved how easily privilege blinds how a whole nation can look away when profit justifies horror. Because genocide isn't always swift, sometimes it's slow, silent, and wrapped in the respectable cloak of commerce. The dirty war didn't fight on battlefields, it hunted in shadows. When Argentina's military junta seized power in 1976, they declared war not on an enemy nation but on their own people. Anyone deemed a subversive, students, union leaders, journalists, even high school teachers, vanished without a trace. The lucky ones were shot immediately. The rest were taken to clandestine torture centers like the Esma Navy Mechanics School, where screams echoed through classrooms converted into dungeons. Victims called them the disappeared, 30,000 souls erased from official records while their families searched in vain. What made this repression uniquely grotesque was its bureaucracy of terror. Prisoners were drugged and loaded onto death flights, thrown alive into the Atlantic from airplanes. Others endured picana electrica electric cattle prods applied to genitals, or waterboarding in baptismal fonts stolen from churches. But the junta's most haunting crime targeted the innocent twice over. Pregnant detainees were kept alive just long enough to give birth, their babies snatched and given to military families as spoils of war. These stolen children grew up with false identities, unaware their biological parents had been murdered in basements beneath the streets they played on. Then came the mothers, defying a regime that disappeared even teenagers. The mothers of Plaza de Mayo began gathering every Thursday in Buenos Aires Central Square. Wearing white headscarves embroidered with their children's names, they marched silently past government buildings holding photos of the missing. At first, soldiers mocked them as Los Locas, the crazy women. But as their numbers grew, so did international attention. The junta couldn't disappear them without causing an outcry, so instead, they disappeared the group's founder, Azucena Villafleur, tossing her from a death flight like so many others. Still, the mothers kept marching. Decades later, forensic anthropologists would unlayer the horror. Mass graves yielded bones marked by bullet wounds and torture devices. Genetic databases reunited stolen children, now adults, with surviving relatives revealing bitter truths. One such recovered grandchild, Ignacio Herban, discovered his biological parents had been a medical student and a psychologist, executed for distributing leftist pamphlets. His adoptive father, a Navy officer complicit in their murders. The dirty war ended with democracy's return in 1983, but justice came in fits. Some torturers faced trials, others were pardoned or died free. The mothers of Plaza de Mayo still march, their white scarves now symbols of global human rights movements. Their relentless search exposed a chilling truth that tyranny doesn't always announce itself with tanks. Sometimes it wears a suit, files paperwork, and smiles while stealing futures in the night. And the only thing more terrifying than its cruelty is how easily the world looked away. Greenwood Avenue pulsed with life on the morning of May 31, 1921. Known as Black Wall Street, this thriving district in Tulsa, Oklahoma, boasted brick-lined streets where black entrepreneurs ran hotels, newspapers, and doctors' offices, a rare oasis of prosperity during the Jim Crow era. But by sunrise the next day, Greenwood would lie in smoldering ruins, its ashes carrying a message to Black America. Success could be a death sentence. The spark came from a rumor, one that slithered through white Tulsa like gasoline. A black shoeshine boy named Dick Rowland had allegedly assaulted a white elevator operator named Sarah Page, though most historians now believe he likely tripped and brushed against her. An inflammatory newspaper headline, "Nabbed Negro for attacking girl in elevator," lit the fuse. By sunset, an armed white mob surrounded the courthouse where Rowland was held, demanding a lynching. When a group of black veterans arrived to protect him, shots rang out, chaos erupted. What followed wasn't a riot but a massacre, a calculated annihilation. White rioters, many deputized by local police, looted gun stores for high-powered rifles while authorities turned a blind eye. Some attackers even flew private planes overhead, dropping homemade firebombs onto Greenwood's rooftops, early aerial warfare against American citizens. Survivors described watching neighbors cut down by machine gun fire in the streets, their bodies left where they fell. Teachers at Dunbar Elementary herded students into basements as bullets shattered windows overhead. Dr. A.C. Jackson, a renowned surgeon, was shot dead on his lawn while surrendering with hands raised. The violence metastasized with terrifying efficiency. White mobs dragged families from their homes at gunpoint, torching 600 businesses and 1,200 residences. Decades of black wealth, generations of savings poured into grocery stores, theaters, and pharmacies vanished in flames. Survivors later recalled the acrid smell of burning photographs and heirloom quilts, the intangible loss of heritage turning to smoke. Officially, 36 died, but modern forensic estimates suggest closer to 300, with mass graves still being uncovered today. 10,000 black Tulsans awoke homeless, forced into internment camps under armed guard, while white families picnicked atop rubble to gawk at the destruction. For decades, the massacre was scrubbed from history books, police records vanished, survivors were threatened into silence. School children learned nothing of the event until the 21st century. The erasure was so complete that when archaeologists began searching for mass graves in 2020, they had to follow the whispers of elderly residents who'd spent lifetimes afraid to speak. The fight for reparations continues today, tangled in legal battles and political resistance. Insurance companies still refuse to honor policies from 1921, hiding behind riot clauses. Survivors like Viola Fletcher, who testified before Congress at 107 years old, demand not just payment but recognition, that Greenwood's destruction wasn't random violence but domestic terrorism sanctioned by the state. The real horror of Tulsa isn't just the bodies buried in secret. It's the certainty that this wasn't an anomaly, just one of countless racial massacres erased from America's conscience. Because when you can destroy an entire neighborhood and pretend it never happened, the lesson is clear. Next time, no one will even remember to look for the graves. The fields of Ukraine should have been bursting with grain in 1932, but instead they became killing fields without a single bullet fired. Under Stalin's orders, Soviet authorities confiscated every kernel of wheat, every potato, every scrap of food from Ukrainian villages, not because there wasn't enough to eat, but because the peasants resisting collectivization needed to be broken. What followed wasn't a famine, it was a calculated genocide called the Holodomor, Ukrainian for death by hunger. While Moscow exported millions of tons of grain to fund industrialization, mothers in rural Ukraine scraped bark from trees to bake into bread, and families watched their children's bellies swell grotesquely from starvation. Survivors described villages where the silence was deafening: no birds, no livestock, just the occasional moan of someone too weak to move. Desperate parents abandoned infants on doorsteps of neighbors who were already skeletal, hoping strangers might spare a crust. Soviet police units called Black Ravens patrolled with orders to arrest anyone caught hiding even a handful of grain, while party officials sealed regional borders to prevent peasants from fleeing. One account tells of a woman boiling her dead husband's leather belt for broth, only to be imprisoned for destroying socialist property. The cruelty wasn't collateral damage, it was the point. Then came the unthinkable. Secret police reports documented cases of cannibalism, with starved villagers resorting to eating corpses or even killing the weak for meat. Soviet propaganda flipped the horror on its head, publishing cartoons depicting Ukrainian farmers as greedy hoarders, sitting on sacks of grain. When foreign journalists like Gareth Jones smuggled out eyewitness accounts, Western governments largely looked away, some sympathizing with Stalin's experiment, others fearing communist backlash. The USSR flatly denied the famine existed, purging census data and doctoring photos to hide emaciated bodies. Even as corpses piled in streets, Soviet officials insisted Ukraine was thriving. The Holodomor's death toll remains contested. Modern estimates range from 3 to 7 million, but the method was unmistakable. Stalin weaponized hunger to crush Ukrainian nationalism, executing or deporting intellectuals who might lead resistance. The few survivors who dared speak up vanished into gulags. For decades, Soviet textbooks erased the famine entirely, while KGB archives held meticulous records of exactly how much grain had been seized from each starving district. Today, Russia still refuses to acknowledge the Holodomor as genocide, dismissing it as shared Soviet tragedy. But the scars persist in Ukraine's collective memory, in families who whisper about great-grandparents who disappeared, in the tradition of keeping emergency bread under cloth as silent tribute. The lesson isn't just about Stalin's brutality, it's about how easily truth can be buried under layers of lies, because when a government can starve millions and call it progress, the real famine isn't of food, it's of humanity. The humid air of Jonestown, Guyana, smelled faintly of sweat and something bitter: potassium cyanide. On November 18, 1978, what began as a utopian dream for 900 followers of Jim Jones ended in a nightmare of unimaginable scale. The People's Temple Agricultural Project, pitched as a socialist paradise free from racism and oppression, had curdled into something far darker. Jones, a charismatic preacher with a messiah complex, ruled his flock through a cocktail of psychological torment and twisted benevolence. Members surrendered their possessions, cut ties with family, and endured public humiliation sessions called catharsis, where Jones would mock their deepest insecurities. But the real horror wasn't the control, it was the inevitability. That final day unfolded with eerie precision. As California Congressman Leo Ryan and his investigative team prepared to leave Jonestown after uncovering abuses, temple assassins gunned them down on the airstrip. Jones, paranoid and delusional, saw this as the beginning of a government crackdown. Over a crackling loudspeaker, his voice trembled with manic certainty as he ordered the revolutionary suicide drill, a rehearsed ritual no one truly believed would happen. Nurses lined up vats of grape flavor aid laced with cyanide, while armed guards prevented escape. Parents were told to administer the poison to their children first, a grotesque act of mercy to spare them from imagined torture. Some drank willingly, singing hymns as their limbs went numb. Others were forced at gunpoint or injected. The jungle compound became a tableau of intertwined corpses, families embracing in death, their faces frozen in silent screams. The aftermath revealed layers of complicity. Jones had cultivated political allies in San Francisco, exchanging votes for protection. California officials ignored years of red flags, from child abuse allegations to financial fraud, dismissing ex-members as disgruntled. The State Department hesitated to investigate Jonestown despite desperate letters from relatives. Even the media initially painted Jones as a progressive idealist, glossing over his drug-fueled paranoia and beatings meted out to dissenters. But the true tragedy lies in how ordinary people became complicit in their own destruction. Former members described Jones's manipulation as a slow boil, starting with genuine social activism, then escalating to sleep deprivation, fake assassination attempts, and staged poison tests to prove loyalty. By the end, followers believed death was preferable to life outside the temple. The massacre wasn't just about cyanide, it was about how easily isolation and fear can warp reality. Today, the empty field where Jonestown once stood serves as a chilling reminder. The road to hell isn't always paved with obvious evil. Sometimes it's lined with idealists holding cups of Kool-Aid, convinced they're drinking to a better world. The snow-swept plains of South Dakota should have been sacred ground that December morning in 1890, but instead, Wounded Knee Creek became the site where the U.S. Army's rifles turned on the very people they'd sworn to protect. The Lakota had gathered under a white flag of truce, many wrapped in ghost shirts they believed would repel bullets, a spiritual movement born of desperation after years of broken treaties, stolen land, and the near extinction of the buffalo. But when soldiers demanded the surrender of all weapons, a single accidental gunshot sparked a massacre. Hotchkiss cannons roared to life, cutting down men, women, and children alike as they fled through the icy ravine. By the time the smoke cleared, 300 Lakota lay dead, their bodies frozen in twisted postures of terror. Some were found miles away, hunted down like animals. Among them was Chief Spotted Elk, an elder too frail to walk, shot point blank as he pleaded for mercy. What makes Wounded Knee especially chilling isn't just the body count, it's the deliberate erasure that followed. 20 medals of honor were awarded to the perpetrators, the most for any single engagement in the Indian Wars. Newspapers initially celebrated the battle as a triumph over hostiles, while photographs of mass graves were sold as tourist postcards. The government would later frame it as the tragic end of the Wild West, as if the slaughter of unarmed families was an inevitable closing act rather than a war crime. But the Lakota never forgot. Oral histories preserved the names of the murdered children, the songs cut short, the cradleboards smashed by cavalry boots. The massacre's legacy didn't dissolve into history, it ignited resistance. In 1973, Wounded Knee erupted again when American Indian movement activists occupied the town for 71 days, demanding justice for centuries of genocide. Federal agents responded with siege tactics eerily reminiscent of the original massacre: sniper fire, food blockades, and propaganda painting activists as radicals. The standoff ended without reconciliation, but it forced the world to acknowledge that indigenous sovereignty wasn't a relic of the past. That same defiance resurfaced at Standing Rock in 2016, where thousands of water protectors camped for months to halt the Dakota Access Pipeline. Once again, militarized police confronted unarmed civilians with attack dogs and water cannons in freezing temperatures. The parallels were undeniable: another fight for sacred land, another generation risking everything to say no more. But this time, smartphones live-streamed the violence to millions, stripping away the sanitized narratives that once justified Wounded Knee. The truth is, these events aren't separate tragedies, they're chapters in an unbroken story of resistance. From the ghost dancers of 1890 to the pipeline protesters of today, indigenous communities continue to demand what was stolen, not just land, but the right to exist on their own terms. Wounded Knee wasn't the end of anything. It was a warning, one that still echoes whenever a government chooses bullets over broken promises, whenever a corporation values profit over people, whenever history tries to call genocide by another name. The snow still falls on that South Dakota ravine, but the ghosts there aren't silent. They're a reminder that some wounds never healed and some knees never stop standing. It was supposed to be just another December night in Bhopal, families asleep, shopkeepers shuttering their stalls, children curled against the chill, until the air itself turned against them. At the Union Carbide pesticide plant, a cocktail of water and methyl isocyanate mixed where it shouldn't have, triggering a chemical reaction that sent 40 tons of lethal gas hissing into the night. Within minutes, a visible fog rolled through the city's poorest neighborhoods, clinging to the ground where people slept. Victims woke choking, their lungs burning as the gas converted into cyanide inside their bodies. Eyes melted, foam bubbled from mouths. Those who ran left trails of vomit and urine as their organs failed mid-stride. The streets became obstacle courses of corpses, parents still clutching children, dogs twitching beside their owners, entire families wiped out as they huddled together for safety. The true horror lay in how preventable it all was. Union Carbide had ignored 6 critical safety systems that could have stopped the leak. Maintenance logs showed technicians disabling alarms to avoid nuisance alerts. The tank that ruptured had been malfunctioning for days, its pressure gauge broken. Even the plant's manual, written in English, not Hindi, warned against the exact scenario that unfolded. Yet when the sun rose over Bhopal, revealing thousands sprawled in the dirt like broken dolls, the company's first response wasn't aid, it was denial. Executives initially claimed the gas was merely a tear gas-like irritant, then later blamed a disgruntled employee for sabotage. The aftermath became its own slow-motion massacre. 15,000 died that night, but the toll kept climbing. 500,000 survivors inhaled toxins that burrowed into their DNA, causing a second wave of suffering: miscarriages, stillbirths, babies born with cleft palates and twisted limbs. A government report found mercury and nickel in breast milk decades later. Yet Union Carbide's settlement, $470 million, less than half the company's annual insurance premiums, amounted to roughly $1,000 per life. CEO Warren Anderson, arrested then mysteriously released on bail, retired to his Hamptons estate without facing trial. Today, the abandoned plant still looms over Bhopal, its rusted pipes leaching poisons into groundwater. Children born 40 years after the disaster play on soil testing positive for carcinogens, while Union Carbide's successor, Dow Chemical, insists all liabilities were resolved. The disaster proved a brutal truth: when corporations value profit over people, the poorest pay the highest price, and justice, that's a gas too odorless, invisible, impossible to hold accountable. The UN-protected enclave of Srebrenica was supposed to be safe. Designated a safe area by the United Nations in 1993, it became a crowded refuge for Bosnian Muslims fleeing ethnic cleansing during the brutal breakup of Yugoslavia. But on July 11, 1995, the world's hollow promises shattered like glass. Bosnian Serb forces under General Ratko Mladic rolled into town, casually handing out candy to children while their soldiers separated men from women with chilling efficiency. What followed wasn't spontaneous violence, it was industrialized slaughter. Over 8,000 Muslim men and boys, some as young as 12, were systematically executed in fields, warehouses, and soccer stadiums. Bulldozers worked overtime to bury the dead in mass graves, then dug them up again to scatter remains across secondary sites, a grotesque shell game meant to hide the evidence. Dutch peacekeepers assigned to protect Srebrenica became unwilling witnesses to genocide. Outnumbered and underarmed, they watched as Serb forces loaded buses with screaming families, assuring them they'd be evacuated safely. Instead, women were raped in abandoned factories while their sons and husbands were marched into the woods, hands bound with wire and shot in the back of the head. One Dutch soldier later described the surreal horror of watching Serb soldiers drink slivovitz and sing nationalist songs between executions. The peacekeepers' radios crackled with pleas for NATO air support that never came, bureaucratic delays and political hesitation leaving them powerless. When the UN compound finally ran out of food and water, the Dutch were forced to hand over 5,000 terrified Muslims who'd sought shelter with them. Most would never be seen alive again. The aftermath revealed a betrayal etched in bones. Forensic teams exhuming mass graves found victims still wearing blindfolds, their identification cards carefully removed. Some skeletons showed defense wounds, fractured arms from trying to block bullets. The International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia later ruled the killings constituted genocide, the first such conviction in Europe since World War II. Mladic and political leader Radovan Karadzic were finally captured after years in hiding, their trials exposing meticulous planning. From leaked documents showing kill quotas to intercepted radio chatter joking about Christmas in July. Yet for survivors, justice felt incomplete. Mladic smirked through his sentencing, and Karadzic, a psychiatrist turned butcher, posed as a New Age healer during his years on the run, publishing poetry while mass graves filled with his victims. Srebrenica's deepest wound isn't just the scale of death, it's the lie it exposed. The never again pledge after the Holocaust meant nothing when the killers wore suits instead of SS uniforms, when the world prioritized geopolitical stability over human lives. Dutch Bat soldiers returned home to PTSD and public scorn, while the mothers of Srebrenica still gather every July to bury newly identified bones. Their white headscarves mirror those of Argentina's Mothers of Plaza de Mayo, a global sisterhood of grief. But here's what the history books often miss: Srebrenica sparked change. The UN's catastrophic failure led to reforms in peacekeeping mandates, and the genocide conviction set a precedent for holding leaders accountable. When Kosovo erupted just 4 years later, NATO intervened swiftly to prevent another massacre. The tragedy proved that justice moves slowly, imperfectly, but it does move. Because the truth about genocide isn't just in the bodies, it's in the determined hands that keep digging them up year after year, refusing to let the world forget. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory was supposed to be humming with productivity that March afternoon. A typical Saturday shift where 500 mostly immigrant women hunched over sewing machines, stitching shirtwaist blouses for 12-hour shifts. But when a discarded cigarette or faulty electrical wiring ignited a pile of fabric scraps, the 9th floor workroom became a death trap in minutes. Flames raced through piles of flammable material while panicked workers rushed to stairwells only to find them locked. Company owners had bolted the exits shut to prevent theft and unauthorized bathroom breaks, a common practice that turned the factory into a cage. Young women pressed against the windows as smoke filled the room, their choices narrowing to burning or jumping. Fire department ladders only reached the 6th floor, and the single rusted fire escape crumpled under the weight of fleeing workers, sending dozens plummeting into the alley below. Horrified onlookers watched as victims, some with their hair and dresses already ablaze, leaped from 8th and 9th story windows, their bodies smashing through sidewalk glass ceilings. Firefighters arriving with horse-drawn engines could only spread nets which tore from the impact of falling bodies. By the time the fire burned itself out, 146 workers lay dead, most of them young Jewish and Italian immigrants barely in their teens or 20s. A public outrage was immediate and visceral. Newspapers ran photos of charred bodies lined up on the sidewalk, each tagged with a numbered piece of paper. Funerals for the unidentified overflowed with mourners, while socialist unions organized massive protest marches demanding accountability. Investigations revealed even more grotesque details: fire buckets filled with rusted water, managers who'd pocketed bribes to ignore safety violations, and insurance policies that paid the factory owners more for the damage than the victims' families would ever see in compensation. But from this horror sprang seismic change. The fire became a rallying cry for the labor movement, pressuring New York to establish the Factory Investigating Commission. Over the next few years, the state enacted groundbreaking workplace safety laws mandating fireproof stairwells, unlocked exits, regular inspections, and limitations on child labor. These reforms didn't just save lives, they reshaped the American social contract, proving that unchecked capitalism needed guardrails. Francis Perkins, who witnessed the fire firsthand, would later become FDR's Secretary of Labor and architect of the New Deal, crediting the tragedy with igniting her lifelong fight for workers' rights. Yet the ghosts of the Triangle Fire still whisper warnings. Many of the victims' pay stubs showed wages as low as $7 a week. Modern equivalents of sweatshops still exploit undocumented workers today. The factory owners, though acquitted of manslaughter, faced no real consequences, their insurance payouts dwarfing the meager settlements given to grieving families. And while the fire spurred reforms, it took 146 preventable deaths to make them happen, a grim reminder that progress often walks hand in hand with tragedy. What makes the Triangle Fire unforgettable isn't just the bodies on the pavement. It's the echoes we still hear in every workplace safety regulation, every fire drill, every unlocked emergency exit. Those young women didn't die for nothing, but they shouldn't have had to die at all. Their legacy is written in the laws that protect us and in the unanswerable question: how many more warnings will we ignore before the next fire starts? The air smelled of tear gas and fresh-cut grass on that sunny May afternoon at Kent State University. 4 days earlier, President Nixon had announced the invasion of Cambodia, escalating a war that had already claimed tens of thousands of American and Vietnamese lives. Now, on May 4, 1970, students gathered to protest, some chanting peacefully, others burning a rock building the night before. No one expected live ammunition to crack across the commons. When Ohio National Guardsmen advanced on the crowd with bayonets fixed, protesters hurled rocks and insults, convinced the soldiers wouldn't fire. Then, at 12:24 p.m., 29 guardsmen suddenly wheeled and unleashed 67 rounds in 13 seconds. 4 students fell dead, 2 bystanders walking to class, 2 protesters waving black flags. One victim, Jeffrey Miller, lay face down in a pool of blood, his scream captured forever in John Philo's Pulitzer-winning photograph. Another, Allison Cross, had placed a flower in a soldier's rifle barrel just hours earlier, whispering, "Flowers are better than bullets." She was 19. The aftermath split America like a fault line. While Nixon called the protesters bums, surveys showed nearly 70% of citizens blamed the guardsmen. The President's Commission on Campus Unrest condemned the shootings as unnecessary, unwarranted, and inexcusable. Yet no one was convicted. Guardsmen claimed they feared sniper fire, though investigations found no evidence of armed students. The truth was uglier. Untrained soldiers, panicked by weeks of anti-war demonstrations, had turned their weapons on unarmed kids. Kent State became a cultural detonator. Campuses across the nation shut down in solidarity, with over 4 million students joining strikes, the largest academic walkout in U.S. history. Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young's Ohio blasted from radios its refrain, "4 dead in Ohio," a generational battle cry. Even conservative parents began questioning a war that could send their sons to die in jungles while their daughters bled on home soil. The shootings didn't just radicalize the left, they eroded Middle America's trust in government. Yet the most haunting legacy isn't in the bullet casings preserved at Kent's museum. It's in how little has changed. From Ferguson to Standing Rock, the pattern repeats: militarized forces confronting civilians, fear overriding reason, and accountability vanishing like smoke. The same rhetoric used in 1970, they brought it on themselves, still justifies state violence today. Kent State proved that when you arm nervous men and call dissent unpatriotic, the distance between a campus and a killing field is 13 seconds. And no amount of official regret can stitch those 4 holes in the American flag. The morning of September 11, 2001, dawned with crystalline blue skies over New York City, a deceptive calm before the storm. At 8:46 a.m., American Airlines Flight 11, hijacked by Al-Qaeda operatives, tore through the North Tower of the World Trade Center, igniting a fireball that could be seen for miles. Forget Hollywood disaster films. This was real-time horror unfolding on live television. As news cameras rolled in disbelief, a second plane, United Flight 175, sliced into the South Tower at 9:03 a.m., erasing any doubt this was an attack. The images seared into global consciousness, people clinging to broken windows 1,000 feet above the streets, office workers leaping hand in hand to avoid being burned alive, and finally, at 9:59 a.m., the South Tower collapsing in a nightmarish avalanche of steel and dust. Al-Qaeda's motives were rooted in decades of U.S. foreign policy grievances, from support for Israel to military bases in Saudi Arabia. Osama bin Laden, the group's founder, framed the attacks as retaliation against American crusaders meddling in the Muslim world. But the 19 hijackers weren't just political zealots, they were tactical savants. They'd trained for years in flight schools, exploiting America's own openness to plot its destruction. The attacks weren't merely about killing people, they were about fracturing America's sense of invulnerability. When the Pentagon was struck by American Airlines Flight 77 at 9:37 a.m., and United Flight 93 crashed in Pennsylvania after passengers fought back, it became clear no institution, no landmark was safe. The tower's collapse defied everything engineers thought possible. The jet fuel fires, burning at nearly 1,000 degrees Celsius, weakened structural steel until entire floors pancaked downward. First responders rushing into the lobbies never stood a chance. 343 firefighters perished, their oxygen tanks exploding like grenades as the buildings imploded. The dust cloud that engulfed Lower Manhattan contained a toxic mix of asbestos, lead, and human remains, poisoning survivors for years. Yet amid the devastation came moments of raw humanity. Strangers carrying the injured on makeshift stretchers, boats evacuating 500,000 people from Manhattan's shores, and ironworkers volunteering to cut through twisted wreckage in search of life. The aftermath birthed the War on Terror, a global manhunt that toppled the Taliban but spiraled into quagmires in Iraq and Afghanistan. The Patriot Act expanded surveillance powers, while Guantanamo Bay became a legal black hole for detainees. Hate crimes against Muslim Americans surged. Sikhs wearing turbans were mistaken for terrorists, mosques were vandalized, and ordinary citizens found themselves on no-fly lists. The tragedy united the nation in grief but also exposed its fractures. The valor of first responders contrasted with the government's failure to protect them from toxic exposure. Survivors like Wells Crowther, the man in the red bandana who saved lives before perishing, became symbols of courage, while whistleblowers revealed how warnings had been ignored. 20 years later, the legacy is still being written. The fall of Kabul in 2021 echoed Saigon's fall, raising painful questions about what the War on Terror achieved. The attacks reshaped airports, politics, even language. 9/11 became shorthand for collective trauma. but the most enduring lesson might be this: terror doesn't just destroy buildings, it tests a society's values. When we trade liberty for security, scapegoat the innocent, or forget the humanity of those we fight, the terrorists win in ways no plane crash ever could. The towers are gone, but their shadow lingers not just in New York's skyline, but in every choice between fear and freedom. History doesn't just happen, it echoes. The events we've explored aren't frozen in the past, they're living warnings carved into the collective memory of humanity. Each atrocity, each moment of unthinkable cruelty, began with the same dangerous ingredients: dehumanization, unchecked power, and the silence of those who could have intervened. From the ashes of the Holocaust to the blood-stained soil of Rwanda, these tragedies reveal a chilling pattern. When we stop seeing others as human, the unthinkable becomes inevitable. But here's the uncomfortable truth: these weren't anomalies. They were extreme expressions of biases and systems that still exist today. The rhetoric used to justify the Trail of Tears mirrors the language of modern xenophobia. The economic exploitation that fueled the Congo's horrors continues in sweatshops and cobalt mines. Even the propaganda playbook painting victims as threats gets recycled in every era, from Nazi Germany to the Rwandan airwaves to today's social media algorithms. The difference between history's nightmares and our present isn't the potential for evil, it's whether we choose to recognize it in time. What makes these stories essential isn't just their shock value, it's their power to awaken empathy. When we hear the screams from the killing fields or the whispered prayers of the desaparecidos, we're not just learning about the past, we're rehearsing for the future. Because prevention starts with recognition. The Black Death led to Renaissance, the Triangle Fire birthed labor laws, even Jonestown's tragedy exposed the dangers of unchecked charismatic control. Transformation often follows catastrophe, but it shouldn't require catastrophe to transform. So where do we go from here? Start by questioning the narratives handed to you. When a group is labeled dangerous or inferior, remember the Armenian grandmothers dismissed as rebels, the Tutsi neighbors reimagined as cockroaches. Research beyond textbook summaries, seek survivor testimonies, unearth suppressed documents, listen to the voices history tried to erase, and most crucially, speak up long before the trains start running or the machetes are distributed. The greatest weapon against darkness isn't hindsight, it's moral courage in the moment. This isn't about guilt, it's about responsibility. You didn't cause these events, but you inherit their lessons. Share them, debate them, let them guide how you vote, how you raise your children, how you respond to the next us versus them slogan. Because while we can't rewrite history, we can refuse to let it repeat. The comments below aren't just a space for reactions, they're the first step in a conversation that might just shape what comes next. So tell us, which of these stories resonates most deeply with you and why? The past is listening.